Hi, Lou Pulsifer here, and I'm going to take a stab at trying to explain when it's a good idea to use dice and when not. But I call this a first cut because I keep feeling that there's more and more to it, even though this is going to be quite long. And of course, the answer is it depends. I occasionally see people asking how much luck should be in a game, and there is no set answer. It depends on the target audience, the player preferences, and also depends on what fits the game, the harmony of the game. In general, the use of randomness or uncertainty, which can be dice or something else, takes you away from puzzles, and not using uncertainty takes you toward puzzles. So-called games that are perfect information and two players are puzzles, not games. But there are other ways to introduce uncertainty than dice. Also, use of dice gives players less feeling of responsibility than if dice are not used. They can blame the dice, in other words, if things don't go well. When dice are used is important. You can use dice before an action when the dice affect everyone, which Jeff Engelstein calls input dice, or you can roll dice after an action when the dice affect just the player taking his or her turn and perhaps one opponent, which is output. For example, in Catan, you roll to determine acquisition of resources. This affects everyone at the same time. So that's input. In a war game, you usually roll to resolve an attack. That's the player's choice, but it affects at least one other player as well, except in co-op games. That's output. Of course, dice add excitement to a game. It's not necessarily a gambling style instinct involved here, though it could be related. Think about it. You rarely see players standing around a table in anticipation and excitement at the climax of a game unless dice are involved. In effect, dice rolling concentrates the uncertainty in a way that attracts many players and is exciting. Now, there's risk management involved in using dice. When I was a young adult, I said, I hate dice games. I may have had risk in mind because I played a two-player risk game once and rolled 1/6 the entire game, which of course I lost. But then I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, which is now my favorite game and has been for like almost about 40 years. But dice can be managed in D&D if you choose to. That's a key to dice games, managing the risk. Don't put yourself in the hands of the dice. Instead, minimize the number of times you have to depend on the dice for your success. Now, some games don't allow that, and those are true dice games. But there are many games that include dice where you can manage the dice. D&D is very instructive in this way, and I could play it back then despite saying I hate dice games. At that time, my favorite game was Diplomacy, by the way, which has no overt random elements but has 7 players, and that's where the uncertainty comes from. On the other hand, if you play for an adrenaline rush of feeling lucky, then you're going to fail to win more than people who manage things carefully. If you want to succeed, you need to control use of the dice, not let use of the dice control you. Or, in other words, he who lives by the dice dies by the dice. Now, many players are content with that. Players who want to win a lot more than they lose are not content with that. It depends on your objective. This is especially obvious in something like D&D 1st edition or 5th edition. There's lots of dice rolling, but you can limit how much you depend on getting lucky or not. Now, there's still lots that's memorable, because sooner or later you're going to have to depend on a good dice roll, but the managers are a lot more likely to succeed. Now, many players feel they can manage cards better than they can manage dice. Some of that may be the inability to calculate odds. I don't know. I was particularly impressed when I bought a copy of Settlers of Catan, as it was known then, quite a few years ago that there was an odds table included for the odds of rolling between 2 and 12 on 2 dice, obviously because so many people did not understand the odds. But mostly the preference for card management, I think, is having things in your hand and having choices versus the obvious roll of the dice where you don't see the choices in the same way. Of course, there are games which are primarily about dice where you can manage your dice rolls, for example, choosing which to keep and which to re-roll. Now, what about warfare? Karl von Clausewitz said, "War is the province of uncertainty. 3/4 of the things on which action in war is based lie hidden in the fog of uncertainty." With uncertainty a strong component of warfare, if you try to model conflict, you'll likely use some uncertain element. L'Attaque and Stratego use hidden identity, as do block games. Charles S. Roberts' early Avalon Hill games used dice to vary the results of actual battle and left the rest as chess-like with no hidden information. And there are other ways to do it. Contrast this with situations not involving armed conflict, where people are usually adhering to laws and being lawful. For example, business competition. Warfare is not a lawful pursuit. When you play a game using dice and things go badly, you can blame the dice. Even if in fact some observer would say your luck hadn't been any worse than anybody else's. But if it's a game without random factors, you can only blame yourself. Also, many modern game players like to blame the game when they fail. They feel that the purpose of a game is to help them succeed. If the game involves dice and they are poor managers of risk, they're more likely to fail. And ultimately they'll blame you, the designer. Yet, more generally, games using dice prominently rescue the player's ego. So, once again, it's very important what your particular target market thinks about these kinds of things. Sterility. How is the harmony of your game affected by the use or non-use of dice? One of my prototypes, which I call Eurasia, it'll probably have a different title when it's published, used a deterministic combat method for many years of testing. And what was important was where you fought in a Rise and Fall of Empires game, but at some point I decided that the deterministic method was too sterile and adopted a simple dice method where the stronger side usually, but not always, wins. Yet there's a Space Empires game where I use the same method and have never felt a need to change to dice. It depends on the game, how it fits the game, how people perceive it. So what are you going to do as a designer? Well, if you're modeling armed conflict, using dice is usually appropriate. On the other hand, if you're making an abstract game, and even Magic the Gathering is an abstract game, use of dice will often put off players. Abstract includes the many games that have an atmosphere or gloss. For example, many Euro-style games, but the atmosphere doesn't affect play. Abstract games are not good models of anything. If they are good models, they're not abstract games. Dice make for more excitement, but more frustration, especially from those who don't know how to manage risk. Does your target market include a large proportion of people accustomed to use of dice? Are they accustomed to being frustrated by RNG, as the video gamers call it, that is, random number generation? Random number generation was generally left out of video games until fairly recently, so that people could depend on their athletic skills to succeed or fail. We haven't had that situation in tabletop games. So, what do they expect? And that helps guide you as to whether to use dice or not. Many serious game players, probably most of them, want as much control over what happens as possible. They often dislike dice, even when the dice are used to affect everyone at once, the input. Casual players are much less bothered by random factors such as dice, Party gamers even more so. Often party gamers don't really care who wins. They play for the journey, not the destination. Where the more serious a game player is, the more they're interested in the destination, that is winning or losing, as well as in the journey. What about dice versus cards? Use of cards as a randomizer, especially if everyone has identical decks of cards that they're drawing from, removes the bite of chance in the minds of many people. If you don't want to use dice but do want similar uncertainty, cards may be the solution. Now, I don't mean cards as a direct substitute for dice, although you can do it. You can be more inventive than that. I have a number of very simple card games that have many abstract elements. The original one, from which several others derive, is diceless. Then I made a post-apocalyptic version that involved fighting between factions, and that uses dice to help resolve raids. Then I kind of reversed the original and deviated into something I called Scourge of the Undead, although now I have a new title, No Dice Again. A related game, which will be published as Pirate Captain, uses dice a lot because a pirate's life was quite chancy. It depends on what fits, and that goes back to harmony again. Sometimes dice or no dice works just as well. I have one game that uses no dice but provides an optional combat method that uses dice. If your deterministic method is simple, you can usually find a dice method that does the same thing. I have one game where you partly use dice and partly use a deterministic method in the same combat. Now, keep in mind the American version of Risk is a dice fest, but the original European version, as I understand from a United Kingdom patent, just traded off armies 1-for-1 without use of dice. Otherwise the same game, but radically different because of the use or non-use of dice. So, as players, he who lives by the dice dies by the dice, but lets them blame the dice and play again to look for a better result. Consider the harmony. Thanks for listening.